heritage. See big place and see what pattern. What these things also. I think we're nearly all ready to start, I think.
Close to 12 o'clock now.
Yeah.
That's probably the sound. It's there. Yeah, I'll call you when. You may hide for a small bit.
You'll be very visually cued into this.
Performing a sound check. Can everybody hear me fine? In the back, getting a nod there. Excellent. Very good. Well, first of all, thank you for all of you who have managed to brave the rough conditions outside to be here at the Minster today. I know it's not easy to motivate yourself when it looks like it does now, but much appreciated all of your attendances. Welcome to this edition of our Heritage Talk series here at Hull Minster, part of our 600th anniversary celebrations at Hull Minster this year. Many of you will have attended these talks before, so you know the shtick I'm about to tell you already. But in case you haven't, this is a series of talks that we're running every other week on Fridays at noon, lunchtime, here in the chancel, same time, same place, every other week, where we give the platform for people to speak about history that interests them to you, whether that be academics, whether that be local tour guides, or whether it's local people who have a real passionate for history and a passionate story that they want to tell you all. And I'm very excited for this talk. I say that every talk, it feels like. But I'm excited for this one in particular because the host of the talk is from the Hull Civic Society, who is someone who has been earmarked to me since I began my role as the heritage manager here as good people to know. So hopefully the talk today on the Garthpool, the last sailing ship, the last Windjammer, does the Hull Civic Society justice, and the brief research I did before this talk seemed really, really interesting, really the end of an era when it comes to the British Navy. So Ian Pearson is our speaker today, treasurer from the Hull Civic Society. So please give him a warm hand as you introduce him to the stage, and I hope that you enjoy this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for turning out today on a bit wet day. The talk about is the last of the British Windjammers, built in Dundee as Duteopolis in 1891 and shipwrecked off Boa Vista, one of the Cape Verde Islands, the most easterly Cape Verde Island. That's a map of Boa Vista. On the 11th of November 1929, Armistice Day, and it will soon be 100 years ago. And I thought it would be interesting to start the talk with a bit about the ship original name, which was the Duteopolis. And this is because until the middle of the 20th century, jute was the second most consumed fibre in the world after cotton. Before plastic, practically everything that was traded was packaged in jute. Think of the thousands of tons of cargo that moved across countries and continents: wheat, rice, sugar, corn, coffee, meat, sand, cement, wood, wool, yarn. If it needed to be packed, it went in a jute sack. From the advent of the Industrial Revolution to the arrival of the Internet, jute was the carrier of the world's commerce. Jute sacks filled with sand. This is jute. And jute sacks filled with sand also provided a barricade against bullets and bombs. And here's something even more interesting. Practically all the world's jute comes from one source: the Bengal Delta of India and Bangladesh. Jute had been grown and used in Bengal for millennia, becoming inextricably woven with the lives of its people. It was the British who, upon their conquest of India, first took jute to England and from there to the world. In the year 1764, quite a long time ago, the British East India Company won a decisive battle against a combined force of Indian princes in a little nondescript town in North India called Buxar. This little remembered Battle of Buxar made the British the rulers of the rich agrarian province of Bengal, drained by the twin waters of the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, two of the longest rivers in Asia. Bengal is a rich alluvial delta made fertile by the mineral-rich alluvium brought down by the two rivers from the Himalayas. In Bengal, among other riches, the British discovered jute. Being a tropical rain-fed crop, jute grew readily in the fertile Bengal delta, with an average rainfall of between 1,500 to 2,000 millimetres, 64 to 79 inches a year. The jute-growing regions of Bengal received just about enough rainfall to let the jute plants flourish without the need for additional irrigation. The plants had been grown in Bengal from time immemorial. It was hand-spun by villagers and used for making jute rope, jute twine, jute bags, and even coarse clothing for the poor made of Hessian fabric. The British soon realised that the locally sourced jute rope this is where Bengal is. The British soon realised that the locally sourced jute rope made from jute plants made for an excellent material for use in the East India Company's ships, while the canvas made using jute made for great material for tarpauling and sail in the sailing vessels. Now, it used to be carried from the Bengal district to England by, Dundee, in fact, in Scotland. For instance, a sailing ship would leave Dundee on the 5th of December and arrive in Calcutta on the 8th of April, 124 days, and leaving Calcutta on the 27th of May and arrive in London on the 11th of September, so 107 days. As you can see, it took quite a long time, really. There was, however, one problem that prevented the large-scale export of jute at this point. Being a dry fabric, it was not possible to mass-produce jute products in factories, and no amount of oil or lubricant or moisturiser then known to man could fix this. All the jute used by the East India Company at this time, therefore, was handmade by local Bengali artisans, until a solution was found in faraway Dundee in Scotland, a port city on the North Sea facing Scandinavia. Dundee, at about this time, was emerging as the hub of industrial whaling in Europe. In fact, the rise of Dundee's jute industry and its whaling industry are intimately connected. Whaling is, or rather was, the hunting of whales and seals for their oil, skin and blubber. Beginning with the 18th century, the demand for whale oil skyrocketed as the Industrial Revolution unfolded over much of Europe and America. A highly prized lubricant, whale oil, was used in practically everything, from street lamps to guns, in watches and in clocks, in soaps and in cosmetics. It was used in margarine for the breakfast spread, and it was used in nitroglycerin to blow things up. Also, literature and culture. Remember Herman Melville's Moby Dick is an epic tale about a whale and a whaler aboard a whaling ship waging war against each other. It would not be an exaggeration to say that in the 18th and 19th century, the ports of the Northern Hemisphere were unfortunately dripping with whale oil. It was thus that in the whale oil-drenched whaling town of Dundee, that an accidental discovery was made. Dipping jute fibre in whale oil rendered it smooth and thus amenable to being mass-produced in factory. In no time, jute mills sprang up all over Dundee, and the British began shipping huge amounts of jute from India to be spun in factories in Scotland after being dipped in Dundee's whale oil. In 1830, the Dundee mills got their first big commercial order to provide packaging material for Java coffee to be shipped from Dutch-controlled Indonesia to Europe by the Dutch East India Company, and by 1850, Dundee had become the largest manufacturer of jute in the world. And so it was that the empire brought together the two most disparate commodities from two far-flung corners of the globe, a tropical grass and an Arctic oil, and made the most unlikely of bedfellows, Scottish industrialists and Bengali peasants. And by the second half of the 19th century, the world's economic output was exploding, with nearly every corner of the globe brought under colonialism and connected to each other through shipping routes. There was a frenzy of trade and economic activity. Picture vast flotillas of trading ships dotting the world's oceans like beetles carrying produce from the farthest corners of the globe, all packaged in jute from Calcutta and Dundee. And Dundee became known as Jutiopolis. And that is the beginning of the story, but we'll continue with the naming of our vessel after the nickname of Dundee, Jutiopolis, and the last of the British Windjammers launched in Dundee in 1891, and what an honour to be named after the city she was built in. The term Windjammer is for a square-rigged sailing vessel. Sorry, this is jute being. This was not in the 18th and 19th century, as you can see. Yeah, and that's the remaking of Jutiopolis, Dundee. And these are the plans for the Jutiopolis that I got from the Dundee archives that I've tried to put together. And it's taken me a bit of time, but I'll hopefully get there. Anyway, the term Windjammer is for a square-rigged sailing vessel having 3, 4 or 5 masts, sailing as close as possible to the wind, hence the name Windjammer. And this photo is taken from Whitby Museum, where the Jutiopolis, or the Garthpool, is on display. Her first owners were Charles Barry of Dundee, and she was later renamed Garthpool 30 years later in 1921, but more about this later. I have been fortunate to have a number of books and actual accounts of this ship, and others to help me compile this brief summary. Captain A.G. Corse, who wrote books called Windjammers of the Horn, I've got the book here, and his Dictionary of Nautical Terms, and Stan Hudgill, an A.B. seaman who was shantyman of the Garthpool, who kept a diary of the last voyage, which were published in the Sea Breezes magazine of the Pacific Steam Navigation Company, Volume 13 for 1930, and later in the Cape Horner, the Journal of the International Association of Cape Horners, and this was Volume 2, Number 51, August 2007. And this was edited by Chris Roach, who actually stayed at our house back in November when I gave this talk to Hull Civic Society. And Chris was a good friend of Stan's. And also my grandfather, Arthur Edward Pearson, this was my grandpa at the end of the Second World War, who was also on board the vessel for our last voyage. as were at least 3 others from Hull. And others have also helped me, and I hope to acknowledge them when possible, such as Basil Lubbock and his 2-volume work, The Last of the Windjammers, which starts with the first verse of a John Masefield poem, Sea Fever. So I'll just tell you the first verse. I must down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. And the wheels kick, and the wind's song, and the white sails shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face, and a grey dawn breaking. The Dutyopolis had 4 masts. She was a bark. She was called a bark because of forward 3 masts. The fore, main and mizzen were square-rigged, and the aftermast called a jigger, which had 4 1/2 sails. She was built of steel and had the large dimensions of 310 foot long. That's almost as long as a football field. 45 foot breadth and 25 foot depth. And she was capable of carrying almost 4,500 tons of cargo when loaded down to her load lines. The circle in the middle and the horizontal line is the line that on the side of the ship, generally speaking, where the ship can load to. Now on the ship, the midship section contained quarters for the seamen, petty officers and apprentices, and also housed the sail locker, galley and donkey house. And the donkey house was where the boiler was, which supplied steam for raising the anchor and hoisting the heavier sails. The half-deck, or apprentices' quarters, measured only 24 feet by 9 feet and had 10 bunks, a table, 2 benches and a paraffin lamp, and clothes were kept in sea chests in front of the bunks. Apprentices were essential members of the crew, aboard to learn seamanship and navigation of the ships when possible, and working very hard but not being paid a wage, only receiving an allowance of ½ crown a week, and their parents paid on average 100 guineas for their 4-year apprenticeships. The Dutyopolis had another 2 owners before being bought by Mr. William Garthwaite when on a voyage from Newport, Monmouthshire to Bahia Blanca in Argentina in 1917, keeping her out of the enemy submarine zone. Her value then was about £6,500. In Mr. Garthwaite's ownership, the bark had many tragedies, events and stories, which have been told in Captain Corse's book. I have been asked to keep the story to a maximum of 45 minutes, but to do so would deprive you of a bit of a history, but I'll do my best. These included the tragic deaths on board during separate voyages of a captain from a stroke, an apprentice who became paralysed, and a crew member who fell overboard whilst working aloft, and all had burials at sea. The bark had to contend with atrocious weather at many times, especially in the Southern Ocean rounding the Horn. This is the vessel rounding the Horn. And in the North Atlantic, including being at sea in the famous storm of 1922, when winds of 108 miles per hour were recorded off the Scilly Islands. And the enormous size of the bark was apparent to those joining her, especially when approaching her at anchor, when the bark was without a cargo, called in ballast, and high out of the water. The ages of some of the masters and mates were clearly older at times than perhaps they should have been. One chief mate, for instance, was 70 years old, and there is a saying at sea in sailing ships of the need to keep one hand for the owners and one for yourself, which at that age was probably a bit difficult. Steamers, powered by coal and nicknamed steam kettles, were often helpful, coming to the aid of the bark, flying the distress signal of N for no and C for yes. These are signal flags. At least once towing her to safety, and at other times offering provisions when the bark had run out of food. With cargoes, the bark could earn £8 per tonne when carrying flour from Australia to New York. However, grain was bought in Australia by Mr. Garthpool, who transported it to England with his ships. The hardiness of a certain captain in bad weather was spoken of, never leaving the wheel even in the roughest, foulest weather. The work of the crew was hard, and it was essential that everyone helped one another. The bark's position was often in doubt, as the need to know accurate Greenwich time to calculate longitude was necessary, and the chronometer, which was relied upon to do this, often lost or gained more time than was known, there being no radio on board to listen to a time signal. However, latitude could usually be obtained from the meridional altitude of the sun at midday using a sextant. Now, we've just got over COVID, and in 1918, just over 100 years ago, Spanish flu was encountered whilst in the USA, and some apprentices and crew members sadly died in hospital. However, surprisingly, milk in a bottle was first seen there at that time, and the cream on top of the porridge reportedly produced the tastiest meal ever. One unusual cargo that the bark once loaded was silk stockings and women's dresses, which had to be closely monitored due to the chance of pilfering. Again, not having a radio meant that important world events, like for instance the end of the Great War, were not known about until after arriving in port, which in this case was Sydney, Australia, 4 months later. These are photographs of the ship. You can see all the sails of this ship making way through the water. This is from the mast, one of the masts looking down on the deck. This shows a lot of the rigging, rope and wire, miles and miles of it on board the ship. This is another photograph from one of the masts looking ahead.
Where is the ship? Where is the ship? Which port?
Oh, it's out at sea. This one's out at sea. This is making way through the water. This is just showing you some photographs of the ship.
I know, but when, photography, I'm a bit confused about here.
Well, I'll get to who took some of the photographs. It's all right. And this is having a relaxing time on deck in after the Christmas Day was often celebrated at sea. However, festivities ashore were sometimes narrowly missed due to having to anchor when arriving at ports just before or on Christmas Day itself. At one time it was celebrated at sea on Boxing Day, as the bark had crossed the international date line on the 24th of December heading east, meaning there was no official 25th of December. On the 1st of March, in Banbury, Australia, a new official logbook was started, and the name of the bark was entered as Garthpool, with owners listed as the Marine Navigation Company Limited of London, and the port of registry was given as Liverpool. However, between March 1922 and January 1923, the bark was laid up into Sunderland and then towed to the River Blackwater in Essex to lay up. And it was for this short voyage that her owners were recorded as the Marine Navigation Company of Canada. And in August 1924, she went into dry dock in Dunkirk in France, and her port of registry was clearly seen as Montreal, and she wore the Canadian Merchant Navy flag. Holders of master's certificates were at this time reduced to selling matches in Oxford Street in London to earn enough money to feed their families. An ungrateful nation could not look after them, even after many masters, officers and seamen had lost their lives bringing food to the country during the war. At least one captain used to loan his records to the apprentices to be played by them on the bark's gramophone player when they had the opportunity. In Sydney, Australia once, a giant of a Cockney seafarer nicknamed Cock Sanderson came aboard with only a pair of dungarees to his name. He made a shirt out of a flour sack and was given suitable clothing by the admiring apprentices. He carried a box of straw to stand on during his trick at the wheel, a salt of the earth seaman. In the Southern Ocean, an albatross landed on deck and was photographed. And could this have been the curse for bad weather? There was once a leak in the hulls when carrying a cargo of 56,000 bags of wheat made out of jute. And this, together with a faulty rudder, made a stopover for repairs in Rio necessary. Water had to be continually pumped out, and the rotting grain had an awful stench. However, the apprentices were rewarded in Rio as the captain gave them $30 each to spend ashore, and they were well treated by the mission to seamen there, as many seafarers are to this day all over the world. And today it's known as the mission to seafarers, not the mission to seamen. On the way home to England, though, they had to boil some of the cargo of wheat as they ran out of food. The bark once made a remarkable achievement, sailing up the River Mersey in Liverpool without a tug. In 1926, the new captain, Captain Thompson, who was called the Old Man out of his earshot, was a teetotaler, non-smoker, but enjoyed boiled sweets, and a bag full of them were handed to a crew member by his wife to give him at special times, with instructions to keep them hidden from him. Captain Thompson was a disciplinarian and gave an order to the first, second and third mates about the crew. "Keep them on the go, mister, keep them on the go. If they sit on their bottoms, they'll hatch out some mischief." On one voyage, he shaved his head. Now, this isn't Captain Thompson, but this is showing you how they had the head shaved. He shaved his head when clear of the bad weather off England and never brushed, combed or shaved again until arrival in Adelaide, Australia, 3 months later. None of the crew dared comment on his appearance. During the passage home, there was once no wind at all for 3 days, and he could be seen walking up and down the poop deck, sometimes whistling shrilly out over the bark stern, getting more and more bad-tempered, until he would clench his fists, look up at the sky and shout, "Don't sit up there grinning at me! Give me a wind or come down on deck and have it out like a man." A favourite pastime of the crew in good weather was cockroach racing. A member of the ship's company was H.V. or Vince Howard, and he was from Hull, who took many of these photographs. Cats dogs, even pigs. And fishing was done, but when possible, by towing a line and baited hook, which made a tasty meal when a catch was made. I have to show you this. This was me a long, long time ago on another ship, catching a similar fish. Probably well, it was a tasty fish. That was in the Caribbean. Yeah. There were also the occasional stowaways who had to be sent home when possible on fishing boats. Captains and mates sometimes had to go aloft to help inexperienced crew. In September 1928, the bark William Mitchell was sold to the shipbreakers, and the Garthpool became the last British Windjammer afloat. Washing with rainwater was often carried out, especially in the doldrums. When crossing the equator, celebrations were had with visits from Father Neptune, who initiated members of his kingdom who crossed the line for the first time. The bark arrived in Hull on the 2nd of August 1929, where the story of the last voyage will begin. In Hull, she was reconditioned and fitted out with a new steel jibboom and a couple of wooden yards. And much of this story, as I've said, has come from the diaries of two of the crew, Stan Hudgill, Stan, and Arthur Edward Pearson, my Gramp. Gramp's ambition was to become a Humber pilot and needed experience of sailing on a sailing ship, as did three of his colleagues. He would take every opportunity to send a letter home to his fiancée, Dorothy. When at sea, watches were kept 24 hours a day, known as the starboard and port watches, the right and left sides of the ship looking ahead. The starboard watch was the captain's, with the second mate in charge, and the port watch, the first mate, of which he was in charge. Now, I try to explain this, but it was an alternating watch, so that the first mate would have the 12 to 4 watch at night time one night, and the second mate would have the 12 to 4 watch the next night, because of the dog watches, which were between 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock at night. And in the second dog watch, between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock, they used to get together and have a relaxing time talking and playing cards and things like that with each other. A full crew list was compiled by Jess Fox, who lives in London, whose great-grandfather, Christopher Bedford Steele, nicknamed Scuppers, was on board. And as you can see, the crew came from all over: Aberdeen, Port Adelaide, Cheshire, Hants, Farnborough, South Africa, Waterville, County Kerry, Newport, Monmouthshire, Wales, Hawaii, Devon, Belfast, Aberdeen, Argyll, and Hull. On a cold, bleak October morning, Wednesday, the 23rd of October 1929, the Garthpool broke away from the quayside of the Alexandra Dock in Hull, in ballast, without a cargo. At the dock entrance, although the hours were early and the weather dreary and wet like today, several people stood gazing at the tall-masted vessel, last of the British-owned deep-water square riggers, little thinking that she was going to her funeral. When the last line was aboard, the ship's people gave 3 rousing cheers, answered by the shore people, and then, as the fussy little tug called Seaman picked up the slack of the tow rope and blew her siren, the great bark, slowly and stately, moved outward. Her goal, Cape Border, South Australia. And this was a little song they sang. To Borders Cape for orders, the Garthpool now is bound. Last British vessel sailing on any ocean found. She flies the old red duster, and bare feet tread her decks, whilst ships, her crews once sighted, are lost and weed-grown wrecks. Stan was very proud and felt honoured to be aboard this vessel among a crowd of typical young British sailormen with a fine old skipper and shell-backed mates and boatswain. And shellback is a nickname for a sailor used by people ashore. Stan felt a glorious sensation of ecstasy and could have thrown my chest overboard with pride. To be making a voyage as an AB in Britain's last of the Mohicans was something to crow about. The crowd were all British subjects, which somewhat contradicts the statements made by some authorities, and I'm sorry about this, that only Dagos and Dutchmen man our windbags nowadays. Gramp was in the second mate's watch, and Stanley Butcher was the second mate of Hull. And there was, I'll tell you who they were. Fuller from Lissherd, Bloro, the French Canadian, Pudgill from Cheshire, Allman, a pilot apprentice from Hull, McPhee from Belfast, Dorman from Cork, and Steels from Farnborough, Kinney from Hawaii, Basson from Hemel Hempstead, and Fenwick also from Hull, and the boatswain William Chenoweth from Aberdeen. The ship set sails when she could. I don't know if you can see, but there is a tow rope here. And anyway, the ship set sails to help being pulled along by the tug, but has to shelter from a headwind nicknamed a muzzler on Thursday, anchoring in Yarmouth Roads. On Friday, the weather has eased, allowing the voyage to continue, but the pumps have to be manned for several hours because the sand ballast that is being carried is full of water and draining into the bilges. And Stan appoints himself shantyman, and the crowd enjoy singing with great zest whilst they work. He has quite a large repertoire in his head, a roving, lowlands, and fire down below, and gets quite hoarse repeating them to the young crew. It is proposed to get the sailmaker, nicknamed Sails, to make a canvas horse for us so as we'll be able to enact the ceremony of paying off the dead horse. In the ceremony, 2 seamen, dressed or posed as policemen, headed a procession consisting of a jockey leading an effigy of a horse, followed by the other seamen. They started forward at the forecastle and went aft to the mainmast, where the horse was hoisted to the lee main yard arm to the singing of the song, The Dead Horse. It was carried out after dark to the accompaniment of blue lights and rockets, and when the horse reached the yard arm, it was cut down and it fell into the sea. Old man Thompson was delighted with the shantying, and Stan believes at times sings himself. Last trip, he sang the solo part of Leave Her, Johnny, Leave Her on the vessel's arrival at Hull. On Saturday, the tug is let go. The winches were used with power from the donkey boiler to hoist the sails for the last time. It is all Armstrong Paintons from now on. And this means, Armstrong Paintons is a humorous reference to the method of pulling or hoisting in sailing ships where no steam power was provided. Anyway, then a near tragic accident happened when chains, ropes and tackle came hurtling down from aloft, missing the crowd by inches as they were all standing directly beneath the mainmast. How everybody escaped unhurt was nothing short of a miracle. Stan glanced aloft, and there was poor Fuller hanging on the topgallant rigging for dear life. What had happened was this. As they were hoisting the yard, the chain tie parted, and the yard came down the mast with a crash. Luckily, the lifts held, the tie pendant and purchase all falling to the deck. Young Fuller had just stepped off the yard into the rigging, otherwise he would undoubtedly lost the number of his mess, which is a Royal Navy term for getting killed. As soon as the excitement was over, however, all hands laid aft, and 3 cheers were given for the tug, the towboat's crew responding accordingly. In the distance, Beachy Head loomed, and this was the last piece of England's dirt they expected to see for some time. On Sunday, Grandprites, it is a lovely day for October, and everybody is in real high spirits under sail, and it is so much different to steam. We are putting our hearts and souls into our work, and although most of us have never been under sail, we are willing enough. Finding out where to place the differently named lines and ropes will make us a decent crowd. We have in our watch an AB, Stan Hudgill, and what a fine shantyman he is. He knows dozens of them, and although a young chap of 23, I believe he has been in sailing vessels all over the world, and a fine sailor too. I took a photo today on the forecastle head, the front of the ship, and the Major took a snap of us. We passed Start Point at 10 a.m. The weather is worsening, and the glass is falling very quickly. Low pressure is coming. This isn't the start of the bad weather, but the weather on Monday did worsen, and sails had to be reduced. And at one time, a sail split from head to foot, and a new one had to be bent on. In the evening, the weather moderated, with the crew engaged, doing various jobs around deck. Stan comments that the food on this packet is very good for a windbag, and soft tack is seen fairly often, and soft tack is bread baked daily by the cook. And the cook nickname is Doe, D-O-E, cooks the salt horse in fine style. We are allowed 1 bucket of water for each watch per day, which we'll have to do until we arrive in the doldrums. On Tuesday, Grandprites, it's still blowing hard, and during the early hours of the morning we were nearly run down by a steamer, so close that its sidelights shone near our port side, and the man on the lookout had rushed out on the section ready to call us. At noon, we suddenly sighted land, and if it had been night time, we would have most probably run ashore. On Wednesday, Stan reports a fair wind at last, and all sail was set. Fuller was on the lookout, and afterwards said to me he had never experienced a finer sight than the view he had from the forecastle head of the sail flapping in the breeze and jerking upwards inch by inch as both watches fell back on the halyards, which are ropes used for hoisting sails, to the rousing tune of "Blow, boys, blow," and this in modern times. There are still places where the shanty is used as it should be, and not only at wireless concerts or sung by stiff-collared gentlemen into a gramophone. We caught a jackdaw today. It flew aboard in an exhausted condition. We warmed it in the galley oven. Stan writes for Thursday that the bark is now well in the notorious Bay of Biscay. But good luck is with us, and we have a fine wind and fair weather, but we're still pumping the bilges. And Grandprites for the 1st of November, what a delightful change to England's most dreary month. This morning it was glorious, and we are now west of Finisterre. Only averaged between 2 and 3 knots today, but in the right direction, southwest. No sign or smoke of any steamer seen, but it will probably be a month or more before we see one, when of course it will be a little event and all hands will turn out. And Gramp writes for the 2nd, at work on the bilges again. The water was the muddy water of the River Humber, and as the pump was not working, we have to bail it out, pulling barrels up by hand. It rained a little this morning, and I caught a bucket of rainwater with which I had a bath this afternoon, and tomorrow will wash my clothes in it. The wind is still light, but freshens at intervals, but doesn't last long. And Stan writes for Sunday, November the 3rd, there's a northeast wind today, and it's a great dobying day. The foredeck looks like a Chinese laundry. The poop is nearly as bad, for the old man and passengers have all been busily engaged in the wash tub. This vessel is a fine steering ship, but the heavy double wheel requires some holding. During her career, several men have been thrown over the axle and received injuries. At times, when running, it takes 4 good men to hold the wheel. Can you see the size of it? The half wheelhouse, which is behind the wheel, which is called a whaleback, that she has is a godsend in bad weather, and we are logging 10 knots course southwest by south. And Gramp writes that he wrote a little bit more to Dorothy, and what a big letter it will be, about 30 pages, writing 10 every week. Stan writes for Monday the 4th, sailing with yard square, course south by west, wind lessening. Old man Thompson is a proper father to us chaps. The man who is fortunate enough to be at the wheel between 8 and 10 in the morning always receives an orange or apple when he makes his appearance on deck after breakfast. One of the passengers, Major Kerr Smiley, often comes on the section and yarns with the sailors. He is a noted yachtsman himself and is at present making this trip to the colonies to go deep-sea fishing in New Zealand. Stan writes for Tuesday the 5th, in my watch below, I have spent the time making a string hammock for the tropics. Some of my shipmates are making canvas ones. Jean Gloro, the Frenchman, is engaged in making a model of the French bark Bousset. One of the brass bounders, which is what they used to call the apprentices with their uniform, is also making a model ship. The sub, as we call the ex-submarine lieutenant, has been cheering us with his fiddle. Of musical talent, we have a fiddler. Jean plays an accordion. Ted, one of the pilots, makes an attempt at melody with a uke. And to crown the lot, we have a gramophone, which is almost worn out already. The next day, Stan writes, the run today was 180 miles. The weather is becoming warmer. One of the passengers, Mr. Steele, or Scuppers, as we have nicknamed him, has decided to live in the forecastle with us and has been keeping a standby in his watch on deck, the same as the other ordinary seamen. He is now learning to steer. Although he is a BA, or Bachelor of Arts, he is very unconventional, and the forecastle joke is that he'll go outward bound as a BA and come homeward bound as an AB, or able-bodied seaman. Gramp writes for the same day, we heard a rumour that we might be able to post our letters when passing Madeira, and so I have finished my letter to Dorothy, and I sincerely hope we will be able to send them. And Stan writes for Thursday the 7th, Porto Santo in the Madeiras was sighted, a summer resort of people from the Canary Islands. A fishing boat under sail heads towards us. Although the Major threw a bottle with a letter overboard, it's unlikely it was picked up, and Gramp's letter never got posted. Later in the day, Madeira appears, and the town of Funchal, nestling beneath the rocky peaks, is seen bathed in sunlight. The northeast trade has freshened. The wind from the northeast is the northeast trade. I don't know where I am. And we are now logging 12 knots. Stan writes for Friday the 8th, sailed between the islands of Palma and Tenerife. This is surely a steamboat passage that we are making. The lofty Dragon's Peak is shrouded in mist, and we are logging 18 knots. The weather is fairly warm, and the trade wind fresh and steady. And the next day, Stan writes, washed down this morning, as is the usual routine aboard this ship. Don't we curse the nice mess the old man's hens make as they go exploring new regions around the ship's deck. Course southwest by south and south-southwest. We ought to sight the Cape Verde Islands tomorrow, and have been at sea 18 days. We have been 18 days at sea today, and Grant writes for the same day, teaching Archie how to steer. We've seen this before, but we'll show you it again. Teaching Archie how to steer between 7 and 8, and he managed very well. Stan writes for Sunday the 10th, today we have a spell from work, and although we have plenty of washing to do, it will have to wait until next week as our washing water is minus, passing the time away strolling the decks. Well, they're not strolling the decks there. As you can see, they're hanging on the end of the yard, a long way up. From the deck to the top of the mast was 150 feet. That's another photograph of them having the haircut. My Gramps on the... Well, that's my Gramp. We are now pairing off as each man finds a shipmate to his liking, and each pair swaps yarns about various ships and places as they pace the decks. And Chris Roach, who stayed at our house, wrote, Stan himself made his Cape Horn rounding in the Gustav, which was a German ship, and in the German Cape Horners Journal de Albatros, it says, when Stan Hudgell joined the ship, he looked like a pirate, wearing a red bandana around his head and sea boots with tops turned down. Graham writes for the same day, another lovely day, average 14 knots, and we are doing splendid for the northeast trades. And so hot this afternoon, I couldn't sleep on account of the heat, and we are all now reduced to pants and vests and bare feet. Tonight, Charlie at the wheel with me on the 8 to 10, and later I was practicing Morse coding with the third mate. On Armistice Day, the 11th of November, which we've just had, and at 11 o'clock GMT, we went aft for the 2-minute silence, which is observed all over the world. Afterwards, we had our photos taken, but later we discovered the Frenchmen didn't observe the silence. But what can you expect from them? This is not my words, this is what we do. My wheel, 6 to 8, and had scuppers with me, but I had to take the wheel myself as we were nearing Cape Verde Islands. At 8:10, I was just going to sleep when Sullivan came down and told us to look how close the land was. At 8:20, we sighted reefs 2 miles to leeward, where the wind was blowing us towards. Stan writes, it was the starboard watch's watch below, and the majority of us had turned in, when suddenly a cry of, all hands on deck, sounded through the scuttle at the same time, accompanied by a scuffle of feet and yo-hoing at the braces. Jumping into necessary gear, we were all soon on deck, and a startling sight met our gaze. Ahead and to leeward of us, a huge mountain reared itself, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, with its sides enveloped in a misty haze. Stan writes for The port watch were pointing the yards, hauling with all their might and main, and then the lookout's cry from the foretop awoke us from our reverie and opened our eyes to the danger we were in. "Breakers ahead! Starboard watch, mizzen braces!" Quickly we jumped to it, cast off the braces and hauled as we'd never hauled before. The island must have appeared suddenly out of the low-lying mist, for the lookout had not reported land till he sighted white water. Immediately the mate sent a man up into the foretop, roused the old man and all the rest of the hands. Then he'd given orders to brace the yards up to try and beat her off from the direction where the reefs lay. But when he saw this would not act, the order was given, "Wear ship," which manoeuvre we were now engaged upon. Over to windward, hard and fast, also standing upright, was the shadowy form of a steamer, which we later found to be the Spanish steamer Axpimendi, and this was probably another lure that got us into this trap, for she looked as though she was underway, even though she didn't have sidelights showing. Our mate probably thinking, "Where she can go, we can go." As we squared the mizzen yards, we could feel our ship slide over a reef, and we knew we were well trapped now, as we had sailed into a cul-de-sac of reefs. To windward were the steamer and reefs, to leeward was the island, astern was the reef, barely covered by water that we had sailed over, and ahead was a chain of reefs and a high promontory. We were lurching in a sickly fashion in the broken water, and then the lookout's cry again, "Surf ahead! Square the main yards!" We had barely grasped the main brace when the ship crashed on the reef with a lurch to port. Everything shook with the crash, and all hands dived into the safety of the donkey house, expecting to see masts and yards come hurtling round our heads. Stan continues, "The foremast took the great shock remarkably well. Although the rigging slackened a bit, everything aloft held, which showed the fine condition she was in, and that she would have been hale and hearty and good for many more years' service if this unforeseen disaster had not occurred. Suddenly she lurched further over to port and began bumping heavily on the reefs. So the captain gave the order to clew up everything, as it was impossible to back her off the rocks and swing the boats outboard. Several of us made for the forecastle and stuffed what gear we could into bags or anything handy, and then stood by to leave the wreck, which the old man thought advisable, as the ship was bumping and lurching, and even yet some of the spars were liable to carry away. The carpenter had sounded the well, a small compartment in the bilges, and found that the ship was making water fast. Up to now, no panic had occurred, and the officers had given orders in a sane manner. At 10:30 p.m., we tumbled into the 2 quarter boats and lowered them into the water. The captain in charge of the starboard boat and the chief mate in charge of the port one. Owing to a little confusion, the starboard boat was crowded, and after we had cast off the tackles and pulled away from the ship's side, 2 or 3 of the sailors dived overboard and swam to the port boat and clambered aboard. I was in the starboard boat, and after pulling a while with oars, the second mate sung out for us to step the mast and hoist the lug sail. By now the moon had set, and everywhere was as black as the devil's riding boots, which only added to our fears, as we knew the place was simply dotted with reefs. By now we were feeling cold and miserable, and wishing the dawn would break so as we could see where we were. We started to sing shanties to try and lighten our spirits, but the singing fell through. And then our passengers handed round cigars for us to smoke, as most of us were without that soothing weed. About midnight, both boats neared each other, and the afterguard, the captain and the officers, decided to anchor till morning. We discovered a heavy stone anchor, a kellic, in each boat, which we dropped over our bows and anchored within range of each other. We tried to sleep, pulling the lug sail over us for warmth, but although we were weary, sleep refused to come, and we smoked and did some surmising as to what island we were off and whether there was any natives ashore. At the first streak of dawn, we hauled our kellics inboard and set the sails and headed nearer inshore, where we found a rocky beach interspersed with sandy patches. Over to the windward side of the island was a white house with a handful of people gazing seaward. We signalled them, and they came down along the beach, 2 of them wading into the lagoon, and began to swim out to us. They did not seem to bother as to whether there were any sharks in the offing. They clambered aboard, 1 to each boat, and with signs and mongrel Portuguese phrases made us understand that we must row inshore a bit further and drop our anchors, which we did. Gramps said that everyone was transferred from our boat to theirs, except Captain Thompson, Butcher, Kinney, Gloro, Hocart, Allman, Oates and himself, as they decided to attempt to go back to the Garthpool and get some gear, as they had nothing but shirt and pants. However, they had to give up after nearly reaching her through being swamped by bad seas 3 or 4 times. I think my grandfather took this photograph at that time. They then beached the boat and took out all the food and gear. 5 of them tried to make the town over the land, the others going along the beach back to the huts. What a walk was had, trampling through rivers, undergrowth and such like, with everyone carrying articles such as case milk, biscuits, water, lights, etc., and barefooted using shirts for pads. After 6 hours' toil, they made the huts again and the remaining crew. And Stan continues the story. We found that the place where we had landed was called Canto. A lookout house composed the village on the island of Boa Vista, one of the most easterly islands of the Cape Verde group. This is the Cape Verde group, and that's the Boa Vista. The natives, who by now had arrived in large numbers, were of the mulatto type, approaching the West African Negro in appearance and speaking a mongrel Portuguese dialect. Crucifixes hung around their necks proclaimed them to be of the Roman Church, but we found out afterwards their religion is based more or less on West African Juju beliefs. Clothing seemed to be of a pretty scanty nature with them, and the menfolk seemed as though they kept their wives busy patching their trousers, which in many cases resembled Joseph's famous coat. The women wore a square-cut Mother Hubbard with a brightly coloured handkerchief to adorn their heads, and both sexes were barefooted. They had ridden over on donkeys, the only means of transportations. All hands now had poor meat, wet, spongy sea biscuits, and a tin of condensed milk issued to each man. As we were in a rather exhausted state, this scanty meal seemed better than any food we had eaten before. After making enquiries, Jean, the Frenchman, who could speak Italian, the Major Spanish, found out that no fresh water was obtainable on the island, goat's milk being the principal drink. The island was alive with goats. Later on in the day, several natives presented us with a few bottles of cider or champagne cider. which they had ransacked from the wrecked Spanish steamer, as her cargo had been 100,000 bottles of it. A newspaper later reported them as being nude and stewed. On Wednesday, the 13th of November, 1929, Gramps says we decided to try and get off to the Garthpool, and 2 of the native boats were taking 3 of us in each, and a native was going to pilot one of the lifeboats through the reefs manned by our chaps. What marvellous fellows they are! I have never seen boats sail into the wind like them. Eventually we reached the Garthpool, and as fast as we were getting our gear, the natives were rummaging. I was able to salvage all my most valuable property, and then when our lifeboat came, we assisted to load her up with stores, and then we bade adieu to the last of England's sailing fleet, and we pulled off to the shore. What a sad ending to the last deep-water vessel, and how many dreams were shattered completely. Mine were absolutely. We had all intended making another voyage in her, and what a ship's crew, all young chaps, everyone ambitious, and then this. Well, it's life over and over again. As we were sailing back, it was rather funny to be sitting alongside a native who was wearing your gear, and some had 3 or 4 suits on. Truly, they are marvellous chaps, but what could you say? It was all salvage, as no one had been left on board. When we landed, the customs took charge, and native women carried everything on board their heads, a distance of a mile or so more, on very bad country, and some of them had babies strapped to their backs. 6 of us decided to stick together, and we made our tea in what you could call a courtyard if you had an imagination, and afterwards we took all our gear on the beach and slept there the night. Stan writes that when he was able to board the Garthpool, he found the whole place turned inside out, with the majority of gear gone, except for 1 or 2 odds and ends and a few more eatables. They salvaged very little. In the meantime, the captain and second mate had journeyed overland on donkeys to the small fishing port of Salray, which is there. So they went aground here, and then they walked all this way for about 30 miles to Salray. Anyway, they went there in the hopes of obtaining transport from the inhospitable spot where we were to the island of St. Vincent, the nearest civilized place. St. Vincent is over here. Anyway, to cut a long story short, because I can see the time is getting on, this is the vessel that took them to Salray, and the vessel, the voyage from where they were to Salray it made the captain seasick, and everything got wet through. And they had to stay in Salray for about a couple of weeks before they were transported back to England by a couple of ships. One called the Avalona Star, and the other one called the Deseado. Whilst Stan was in it stands claim is that without any contention, he is Britain's last deep-water shantyman, and as such was toasted by the consul in full hearing of the Garthpool's crew. The last shanty sung aboard a British sailing vessel was Fire Down Below. Sorry, I can't see the... Anyway, it went like this. The parson was a misery, so scraggy and so thin. To me way, hey, he, hi, ho, says he, look here, you shellbacks, if you lead a life of sin. Oh, there's fire down below. And it went on like that. When the ship got back to England, many things were made to commemorate the ship's last voyage, and I'm lucky enough to have a few of these articles. Like this was like an ashtray, I suppose, and mugs. In 1980, the Garthpool was one of the stamps that featured on the first edition of a set of stamps that were issued in the Falkland Islands. And she was the journalists of many papers in England and all over the world talked about the Garthpool. But that was almost 100 years ago and largely been forgotten. And that's about the end of the story. But I can go on a little bit, but thank you. Thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
Where is the ship now? Still on the bottom of the sea somewhere in
The ship.
the islands.
The
Garthpool. Is it somewhere in there?
Yeah, the ship.
But nobody's done anything to look at it more recently.
It's under the waves. It's under the water. It's a wreck. Well, it's impossible, really. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it would be lovely, wouldn't it? But it's such a big ship. Yeah.
In the back, please.
Well, it's on my computer. Yes, it's on my computer. That'd be a great idea. Yeah, yeah. USB sticks. DVD. Yeah. Yeah, it'd be lovely that, yeah. If people were interested enough to, to buy it.
I'll have to break up the conversation now. In the benefit of time, yeah, continue discussion between yourselves, and I highly recommend if you want to discuss any more with Ian Pearson. He's got a litany of things behind me as well, some of the memorabilia regarding the Garthpool behind me. So if you want to take a closer look at that, it is behind me, and you can speak to him about it. But thank you very much, everyone, for attending the talk. Good. Good luck. Yeah, good luck getting back home in the wet weather. Again, thank you all for attending despite the wet weather. Our next Heritage Talk is 2 Fridays from now, the 28th of November. It's another maritime story regarding a shipwreck off the Holderness coast, which is being hosted by Helen Good. She's told me it's less about the shipwreck and more about the story of the people who went out to scavenge the ship and sort of what they got up to there. So we heard plenty of great stories today, so hopefully you'll hear a few then. As always, I like to recommend visiting the cafe because it is lunchtime, so please grab yourself something to eat, especially while we wait for the weather to die down, knock on wood, hopefully. And as I always end these sections saying, if you can make a donation to the church, please do. As you've seen with the wet weather, you've noticed buckets sort of lying around, and obviously for a building of this size and of this age, the last thing that you want is dampness and moisture in these areas. So it's difficult enough to maintain the church as it is, let alone keep it intact. So if you can make a donation, please do. Otherwise, thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Thanks for coming.